The Gestalt IT Rundown, your weekly look at the IT news of the week to find out what really matters in the world of IT. I'm your host, Rich Stroffolino, and joining me all the way from WLPC, the travel man himself, Tom Hollingsworth. Tom, welcome to the show.
Hey, Rich. It's a pleasure to be on in chilly Phoenix, Arizona.
Yeah, it was like the temperatures were inverted pretty much all across the Southwest, right?
Pretty much. And of course, being in Phoenix, chilly could mean 80. But yeah, it was a little brisk outside this morning.
How's WLPC been otherwise?
So far, it's been pretty good. Lots of great discussions. Had some deep dives yesterday. It's not just about wireless. If you wanted to learn about 3D printing or some of the other things going on, they've got classes that'll get you taken care of.
So I have to ask, 3D printing is awesome. If I'm a 3D printing company, why am I at WLPC?
Well, so the funny thing is it's not the companies that's doing it. It's the wireless LAN community. There are several folks involved that they have a 3D printing hobby, and the organizer of the event, a wonderful man named Keith Parsons, said, hey, why don't you run some classes? So they did. They bought a whole bunch of 3D printers, set them up, and are teaching people how to do 3D printing, along with, some more traditional topics like doing Python-related things for networking or doing pen testing with Wi-Fi pineapples.
Very cool stuff. Very cool stuff. Well, let's jump right into the news of the week. We had some big news coming out of the Qualcomm Broadcom merger hostile takeover thing that may or may not ever happen. Basically, Qualcomm has a new strategy: make themselves less attractive to buy from Broadcom. Qualcomm increased their bid to acquire another company, NXP Semiconductor, to $44 billion, which would equate to about $127 per share. They're actually going to end up buying less shares a little bit, but overall the bid does increase substantially. As a result of that increase in their offer for NXP, Broadcom responded by cutting its bid by $4 billion from $121 to $117 billion, or $79 a share. The big meeting happening basically where Broadcom is going to try and get people friendly to the hostile takeover put on Qualcomm's board is happening on March 6th. Interesting strategy. It's let's see if it works out, right, Tom, for what Qualcomm's doing here?
It's really entertaining to see this happening. Qualcomm just doesn't want to get bought. And this is like the pufferfish strategy. I'm going to do everything I can to avoid this. And I don't think Broadcom really cares. Broadcom will just wait it out. If this strategy pays off for Qualcomm, they have to digest NXP before they can do anything else. Maybe Broadcom just waits until a whole bunch of shareholders are unhappy with this NXP acquisition and swoop in and get it for less money than they were planning on in the first place with the addition of NXP.
Does the NXP piece, though, does that that wouldn't add really anything overall to Broadcom's portfolio? Is that something they'd have to divest and just make it more complicated? Or is it just, hey, now we have a company with even more debt that we're trying to acquire, and that just makes it harder?
I think that's the reaction from Broadcom lowering their acquisition target prices. They're basically saying, if you do this, there's nothing here we want. So, yeah, we're going to have to spin it off, because they've already done that with a lot of other things after their Brocade acquisition. Or maybe they're just, they're not excited about all that debt that they'd have to take on anyway. It's stock market stuff tends to drive me crazy after a while.
Well, overall, do you think this move moves the needle in terms of, is this going to happen? Will this not happen? We'll know in a little over a week, right? Whether this is actually probably going to happen, right?
The board meeting is probably going to be the best indicator. I would say on the whole, it probably moves the needle a little bit more toward not likely to happen. But I don't think it's going to not happen at all. It just may take a little bit longer. Broadcom and Brocade took forever, and that was pretty much a done deal from the day it was signed.
Can you remember in recent memory a company kind of dragging, or like going kicking and screaming into the cold nights of trying to be acquired like Qualcomm is?
Not like this. There's been a couple of hostile type takeovers, but generally when they're hostile, they're really quiet, and you don't hear about it until after everything's kind of done. But this feels like a soap opera. If I had popcorn, I'd be eating it right now.
Yeah, it is really interesting that Qualcomm's whole argument is that they're being massively undervalued. And again, given that their chips are in basically everything, their CPUs are pretty much the de facto or the de facto standard for any kind of smart device or anything that requires high-powered ARM. It is outside of Samsung's Exynos, which are a far second from there. It is interesting that there is an argument to be made that they are being trying to be bought out on the cheap, even for $117 billion.
Yeah, but companies don't make money when they buy things for what they're worth. They buy them for what they think they're worth.
Well, the value of ARM processors may actually be increasing as we come to the world of Windows 10 running on ARM processors. If you're, not familiar, Windows only runs on x86 for the most part, unless there's like some weird MIPS thing from 1992 that's still running out there somewhere or something. But for the most part, all Windows is running on x86 and has been forever, and we always thought would be forever. But now Microsoft has announced that Windows 10 is going to be running on ARM and has recently published what are going to be some of the limitations, right? Because traditionally, the reason that we haven't seen more architectures running on Windows is the entire advantage of Windows is this huge legacy ecosystem, which goes entirely out the door if you take on another architecture, right? Microsoft says, hey, our processor is so great now, we can emulate the vast majority of your x86 needs. You're not going to have any problems. And everyone's like, I think there's going to be some exception to that. And we're kind of finding this out now from Microsoft. So let me just run them down for you real quick here. We're not going to see any 64-bit x86 apps working in emulation on ARM. I don't know if this is as of right now or forever, but that seems like kind of a huge deal for a lot of applications. It does actually speak more to the legacy part of having like pure, like old school, crusty Windows apps. So that's at least good, but you would think a lot of people are transitioning to 64, so that'll be a pretty big penalty. Utilities that change the user interface will need to be recompiled, and this has big implications for any kind of accessibility apps, which are, the vast majority of those are going to be changing the interface in some way. So the question is, will the accessibility be there for people that need that on the launch of Windows 10 for ARM? We're not going to see any x86 drivers work via emulation, which makes sense. I don't know if anyone's surprised, but like printer drivers are already the worst thing ever. So now the fact that we're going to have to wait and have no updates on those, it seems like that's kind of a huge thing. No Hyper-V, which isn't surprising. I mean, if you're emulating, they're going to come out with some hypervisor for ARM on Windows, right, Tom?
They have to. They don't have an option.
Yeah, so that's not like that big of a deal to not have Hyper-V right out of the gate. And then apps that target OpenGL or DirectX 8 or older just won't work. So, but that kind of undermines a lot of the legacy story. You're not going to be playing any of your old school, Half-Life probably ran on DirectX 8 or something like that. So, won't be too surprising that you won't be able to dig too far back. And I'm still dubious if like apps even like DOSBox or something like that are really going to work all that well via emulation. So, who knows how that's going to work. Tom, in that big list there, took a little while to run through. Are there any deal breakers as to, hey, we want to have these super, these nice, cheap, thin, light, battery lasts forever, Windows 10 ARM laptops? Any reason you don't see enterprises, large organizations being able to deploy this from that list?
No, and the reason why is because of the use case. These are basically going to be slightly heavier Chromebooks. And if you treat them like that, it makes a lot of sense. No games, no heavy apps, no crazy driver stuff. You basically have a web browser and some lightweight stuff running there. That works for what they're probably going to be targeting the use case for. If you want a gaming laptop, you wouldn't be buying an ARM processor anyway.
The weird thing is, though, we've seen Microsoft is so thirsty to find a way to make Windows sleeker, more versatile, and be able to compete yet in that Chromebook space. Windows RT was a complete disaster. Even though I think overrated, I just think the fact they called it Windows was a disaster and there's no legacy app support. Windows 10S, we've seen try, fail in the sense of it as a distinct SKU. We're going to have the S mode, or whatever we talked about last week, where that basically brings you into a totally slimmed down, scaled back version of Windows that only runs Windows Windows from their apps or excuse me, applications from their own store, not any third party or legacy apps and that kind of stuff. And now we're seeing Windows 10 for ARM. So, Microsoft clearly has identified this as the way they need to grow. Whether this is the recipe that wins, it remains to be seen.
It's the reason why Apple didn't call their phone operating system OS X Mobile. It's because people have they have their own preconceived notions of what an OS should do when it's called Windows. And when you start telling people it won't do any of those things, that's when people start getting mad at you. So either they need to rebrand it so that people understand the experience they're getting is not full Windows 10, or they need to do a better job of spelling out what it can do versus what it can't do.
It's just the specter of Steve Ballmer just telling everything needs to be Windows all the time. And it will not, even with the Satya Mania, it still creeps in from every now and then. You can just see this flop sweat just kind of dripping through the seams of Microsoft as we speak.
When you're Microsoft, that's a legacy you have to deal with.
I mean, that's what keeps them being the Redmond gorilla, but it's also what allows them. They're this. I mean, we talk about Cisco being this enormous battleship that's hard to turn on, IBM being these massive behemoth companies, but it's the pervasiveness of Microsoft that makes it so hard for them to really pivot.
Yep.
All right, we have a kind of a really interesting story coming out. Tom, I don't know, do you run any ad blockers on your browser at all?
I do.
Yeah, I don't run an ad blocker, but I do run the EFF's Privacy Badger, and that is often identified as an ad blocker. And a lot of times you'll get a window when you go to like Wired.com, for instance, is particularly notorious for that. Oh, you want to view our content? Whitelist your ad blocker so we can serve you ads and make money. And it's really user hostile. I'm not a fan of that. I'm just going to find a way to read that article, whether it's through your RSS feed or whatnot, still not see the ad, and then you just turn me off as a reader. Well, Salon have been doing this. They're trying a new strategy though, crypto mining. They're going to be using it's in beta right now, and they're going to be using the CoinHive browser-based mining plugin, which previously has only made the news when people use it super shady to mine in the background and not tell people. But this is going to be an opt-in experience so that if you're running an ad blocker, you can, see the content as long as, we mine some crypto on the side. I like it in principle, Tom, but I did some back-of-the-envelope math, and here's what I found. On my MacBook Pro, I was running the CoinHive plugin. With one thread, I was able to get about 10 to 12 hashes per second, which, like if you're into crypto, was like super low, but only took up one thread. I have 4 threads on my CPU, so it's really doesn't hurt my performance all that much. So extrapolating that, let's assume Salon gets something like 20 million hours read on the site per any given time, per week, per month. I don't know if that's a realistic number, but whatever. Whatever. So looking at that, with that kind of hash rate, they would only see about $150 total in revenue. You can skew that a little bit. You can say, okay, what if the cost of the cryptocurrency goes up? They're mining Monero in this case. That's optimized kind of for this use case. Maybe the algorithm gets more efficient. Maybe you're seeing something like 15 hashes. Maybe they use more than one thread, or they're using some sort of dynamic scaling so that if you're using really low amounts, it'll spike up the threads that you use or something like that. Still, I can't see it being more than hundreds of dollars, in a tens of millions of hours spent on the site. I mean, Tom, I'm curious. Do you think this is, one, a good idea, and two, one that could ever be made viable?
No and no.
So why is it a bad idea versus ads?
Well, so ads, the way that ads work now is very straightforward, and you've probably seen this if you've ever gone down a clickbait hole. Get as many pages in front of people as you can, because the more they click, the more ads we can serve. And this model is actually optimized for the exact opposite. You want one person to be on one page as long as humanly possible to mine as many of those hashes as they can, which means your content has to be reorganized so that it's longer form, which is going to make your writers really love you, because now you're going to have to pay more money for them to put stuff up, which means you're either going to have to drop freelance or you're going to have to lean on your people to produce more stuff. And viability long term, well, I mean, here's a pile of Bitcoins in my hand. Can you see how much money I can buy with them? At least with ads, the model is kind of is driven around companies that are putting these things up. If you're mining cryptocurrency, you might as well be mining for, unobtainium or something, because they're both about the same thing, an imaginary substance that people think has value just because somebody said it does. That's not going to work. And what you're going to find out is it's kind of hard to keep the lights on with imaginary things.
I do think it might be interesting for a company. You need a massive scale for this to ever feasibly work. And you're absolutely right. If all of a sudden the bottom drops out of this, suddenly you don't have a model. I mean, the online advertising space is shady and built on all sorts of assumptions that are probably wrong or at least erroneous or based in myth or something like that. But at least that's not going to drop off overnight. Whereas, as we've saw with the crashes of pretty much every cryptocurrency over the start of the year, can happen very, very quickly. What I think might be an interesting model is, like you were saying, sites that are optimized for video. If you're only running one thread in the background, you can still run video pretty well. Most CPUs are able to handle that pretty ably. So I can imagine someone like a Twitch creator who has a dedicated audience who are going to be watching him 3-4 hours at a time, something like that, putting their Twitch stream on their own personal site, saying, "Hey, if you go to my site, you're going to mine some crypto," and be upfront about it. And they have this type of engaged audiences, I think, that could take advantage of that. That's kind of the way I would think it would have to be. Even still, I mean, people are just so used to the if people's fans are running all the time. I don't know. Also, CoinHive is like toxic branding. Mm-hmm. So I don't know why you would go with CoinHive either. Why not just? It doesn't seem like it's all that sophisticated of a plugin. I don't know why you just don't develop it yourself. That's a whole other discussion.
Yeah.
All right, Tom, we're running low on time here, but I want to hit this up. The Linux user group, Linux Questions, they're one of the larger ones out there. They have about 500,000 members, active members on their site. It's a really cool place, and they did a recent survey to kind of find out what are some of the apps and distributions of the year. So I wanted to run down some of the results. One of the biggest ones is that Emacs, in the massive text editor wars that consume message boards everywhere, is the third most popular of the major text editors. If you're not familiar with that, it's usually V/Vim is the other one. And then if you're a simpleton like myself, you use Nano. And Vim, by a huge margin, was the number one, and then Nano coming in second. So I thought that was interesting. The other one that I thought was really interesting is that in terms of server distributions, Slackware beat out Ubuntu long-term support and CentOS, Red Hat Linux. And it's just really surprising to see just kind of a distribution that's committed to openness, but pretty. You need to know your Linux to run Slackware, especially on the server level. Pretty surprising. The other big one I saw that was really interesting was that in terms of databases, the most popular database surveyed was MariaDB ahead of MySQL and Postgres. So I don't think that's necessarily as controversial, but definitely shows. Maybe a little bit swiftness to adapt to databases versus server distros and that kind of stuff. Other ones that I thought you might be interested in, Tom, in terms of networking monitoring. Is it pronounced Nagios? Nagios?
Nagios.
Nagios 11 and Nagios Core were the most popular network monitoring, and unsurprising, Wireshark was far and away for kind of any kind of network analysis. Tom, are you much of a Linuxman these days?
Not anymore. I don't have time to play with it like I used to. That last eMerge world in Gen 2 really screwed me up. So, but I am happy to see that Slackware is still holding its own after all these years. I'm disappointed that Emacs only placed third in the text editor wars, but I'm pretty sure it still holds number one in the operating systems that pretend to be text editors lead.
Yeah, and again, Nano is for the chimps that are on the typewriters like myself is a great alternative, and I love it, and I will defend it as the tool of the fool for forever. Also notable, Puppy Linux was rated number one for lightweight Linux distributions, and that's my go-to. Puppy Linux, I love you. Also, kind of a derivative of Slackware too. So I see that's keeping it alive. Which reminds me, it's my time for my annual Linux sojourn. I just have one old laptop that I just install like a new distro of Linux on once a year, so that'll be fun. But we are just about out of time for the Gestalt IT Rundown. Tom, thank you so much for this. This was great.
No problem. Glad to be here.
We're live every Wednesday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern, and we'll be on Facebook going forward. Let us know what you think of this new format. We have some new tools. It's pretty awesome. And so we are going to be getting out of there on that. If you have any comments, suggestions, shoot them to me on Twitter at Mr. Anthropology. Tom is at Networking Nerd, and GestaltIT.com is where you can find writing for both of us. So until next time we meet, remember, have a super sparkly day.